was the fall of 2003, a quiet evening in a small, tight-knit community nestled in the rolling hills of Appalachia, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where doors were left unlocked and the local diner doubled as the town's social hub. But that year, a sense of unease had gripped the town, and by October, rumors had turned into full-blown fear. People were disappearing. It started subtly. First, it was a college student who had gone hiking in the woods and never returned. Then a local mechanic vanished on his way home late at night. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just vehicles abandoned on dirt roads or left at trailheads. By the time the fifth person disappeared, folks were locking their doors and whispering about something far more sinister than coincidence. In the middle of this growing tension was Joe Carter, a middle-aged man who had spent his entire life in that small town. Joe was known for his resilience, practicality, and an unwavering sense of loyalty to the people he cared about. He wasn't one for superstition, and he had little patience for the growing whispers about the thing in the woods. But Joe's life took a sharp turn on October 23rd. That day, he received a call from his younger brother, David. David was an amateur photographer who had a habit of chasing obscure landscapes for his portfolio. He told Joe he was heading out to the old Blackwood Trail, an overgrown path deep in the forest that even the most seasoned locals avoided. Joe had warned him about the disappearances, but David brushed it off, saying, "I'm not scared of a little folklore." By nightfall, David hadn't returned. Joe tried calling his brother's phone, but there was no answer. When he drove out to the trailhead, he found David's car parked just off the road. The door was unlocked, and his brother's camera bag was sitting in the passenger seat, but there was no sign of David. Against his better judgment, Joe decided to go looking for him. The Blackwood Trail was a local legend in its own right. Locals told stories about strange sounds coming from the woods, about how animals wouldn't enter certain areas. Hunters spoke of their dogs refusing to go further than a certain point. It was said that the trail led to an old clearing where a cabin had once stood, though no one who went looking for it ever seemed to find it. Joe grabbed a flashlight, a hunting knife, and his brother's camera from the car before stepping into the dense underbrush. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, and unnervingly still. Not even the usual sounds of crickets or rustling leaves broke the silence. It wasn't long before Joe began to notice strange things. The trees around him seemed unnaturally bent, their trunks curving at odd angles as though they had been warped by some invisible force. The ground underfoot felt spongy, as though it was absorbing his footsteps. Then came the sounds. At first it was faint, like the distant hum of a conversation just beyond the range of comprehension. But as he moved deeper into the forest, the voices grew louder. They weren't human voices, not exactly. They sounded layered, overlapping, as though a dozen people were whispering at once in a language he couldn't understand. Joe tried to rationalize it as the wind playing tricks on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. It was then he spotted the first sign of his brother. A single hiking boot, caked with mud and half buried under a cluster of ferns. Joe knelt to pick it up, but as soon as his fingers touched the leather, a faint sound, a low, guttural growl, rippled through the air. Joe froze. The growl came again, this time louder, resonating in the pit of his stomach. Slowly, he turned his flashlight toward the source. The beam illuminated a pair of glowing amber eyes staring back at him from the shadows. Whatever it wasn't human. It moved fast, too fast for Joe to process. One moment the eyes were there, and the next they were gone, leaving Joe stumbling backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He yelled his brother's name into the trees, his voice breaking the eerie stillness, but the forest swallowed the sound. Joe pressed on, convinced he was close to finding David, or at least some answers. That's when he saw it. A clearing, just as the stories described, bathed in an unnatural light that seemed to radiate from nowhere. In the center of the clearing stood an old well, its stone structure covered in moss and vines. Around the base of the well were scattered items: shoes, backpacks, a shattered phone, all eerily familiar. Joe recognized some of them as belongings of the people who had gone missing. As he approached the well, he saw the edge of something sticking out from behind it. A hand. His stomach turned as he stepped closer, praying it wasn't his brother. But before he could see, the ground beneath him shifted. The earth itself seemed to ripple, as though it were alive. Joe stumbled back, but not before something grabbed his ankle. Something cold, wet, and impossibly strong. The whispers grew louder, now forming words that Joe couldn't quite understand, yet they filled his head, drowning out his thoughts. Joe yanked his leg back with all the strength he could muster, his heart pounding in his chest. The grip around his ankle was unrelenting, cold and slimy, like the hand of something long dead. He clawed at the ground, digging his fingers into the damp earth, trying to pull himself free. The whispers were deafening now, not just around him but inside his head, like 1,000 voices speaking in a discordant, maddening chorus. He turned his flashlight downward, shining it at whatever was holding him. What he saw nearly stopped his heart. A hand, pale and mottled, was emerging from the earth itself. The fingers were unnaturally long, the nails jagged and cracked. The flesh was translucent, veins visible like dark rivers running beneath the surface. It wasn't just grabbing him, it was pulling him. Joe's survival instincts kicked in. He reached for his hunting knife and slashed at the hand. The blade tore through it, and the thing let out an otherworldly screech that reverberated through the clearing. The hand recoiled, sinking back into the ground, as if it had never been there. Panting, Joe scrambled to his feet. He knew he should run. Everything in his body was screaming at him to leave, but his brother's hand was still visible, lifeless, poking out from behind the well. Swallowing his fear, Joe edged closer, his flashlight trembling in his grip. As he rounded the well, he saw it wasn't just a hand. David's body was slumped against the moss-covered stones, his face pale and eyes wide open, staring at something far beyond this world. His lips were parted as if he had been mid-scream, but no sound came out. Joe knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder. "David!" he hissed. "David! Come on! Wake up!" David didn't move. Joe pressed his fingers to his brother's neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, but there, a fragile thread of life still tethering him to the world. Relief washed over Joe, but it was short-lived. The whispers shifted, no longer incoherent. Now, they formed words. "He is ours." Joe's blood turned to ice. The voice was deep and guttural, resonating in the clearing like a low growl. He whipped his flashlight around, scanning the shadows. The trees seemed to close in, their warped trunks twisting like skeletal fingers. The clearing itself seemed alive, breathing, pulsating with some unnatural energy. He hoisted David onto his shoulders, grunting under the weight. His brother was limp, unresponsive, but Joe wasn't leaving him behind, not after coming this far. As he stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the ground beneath him shifted again. He froze, feeling the earth ripple like water beneath his boots. Something was coming. From the darkness beyond the well, figures began to emerge. At first, Joe thought they were people, human silhouettes stepping out from the shadows, but as they drew closer, he saw their faces, or rather, the lack of them. Their heads were blank slates, no eyes, no mouths, just smooth, featureless skin stretched taut over skulls. Their bodies were equally strange, moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, as though they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Joe staggered backward, his flashlight flickering as the figures closed in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing in his mind like a relentless chant.
Leave him, leave him, leave him.
No, Joe shouted, his voice cracking. He's my brother. The figures stopped, tilting their heads in eerie unison as if considering his defiance. Then, without warning, the one closest to him lunged. Joe swung his flashlight, the metal casing connecting with the creature's head. It staggered back, but didn't fall. Instead, it straightened, its head twitching unnaturally, and advanced again. Joe ran. With David on his shoulders, he sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at his face and arms. The ground beneath him felt unstable, like running on quicksand. The whispers followed him, relentless, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The trees began to change as he ran, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes, some resembling screaming faces, others looking like hands reaching out to grab him. The air grew colder, each breath burning in his lungs. The flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, leaving him in total darkness. And still, the figures followed. Joe could hear their footsteps, impossibly fast and unnervingly quiet, gaining on him. He didn't dare look back. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, his muscles screaming in protest. David's weight was dragging him down, but he couldn't stop. Not here, not now. Then he saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering through the trees. It wasn't natural, not the soft glow of moonlight or the warm amber of a campfire. This was cold, blue, and unsteady, like the light from an old CRT monitor. But it was the only thing breaking the oppressive darkness, and Joe had no choice but to follow it. The light led him to a clearing, different from the one with the well. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its walls warped and rotting. The blue light seeped out from the cracks in the wood, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Joe hesitated for a moment, but the sound of footsteps behind him spurred him on. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside, collapsing to the floor with David still on his back. The door slammed shut behind him, seemingly of its own accord. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Joe lay there, gasping for air, his body trembling from exhaustion. The cabin was empty, no furniture, no windows, just four walls and a dirt floor. The blue light came from a strange symbol etched into the far wall, glowing faintly and pulsing like a heartbeat. He turned his attention to David, shaking him again. "Come on, David," he pleaded. "Wake up, please." David's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, Joe felt a surge of relief. But then his brother's lips parted, and a voice that was not his own came out. "You should not have come here." Joe's breath caught in his throat as his brother's mouth moved, but the voice wasn't David's. It was deep, guttural, and resonated with an unnatural cadence. It sounded like 100 voices speaking in unison. The air in the cabin grew heavy, charged with a pressure that made Joe's ears ring. "David?" Joe whispered, his voice trembling. "David, it's me. Wake up." David's head turned slowly, his movements robotic. His eyes, once familiar, were now pools of inky blackness, swallowing the dim blue light of the cabin. He stared at Joe with an intensity that felt inhuman, invasive, as though the very act of looking was stripping Joe of his will to fight. "You do not belong," the voice growled through David's mouth. "This place is not for the living." Joe stumbled back, his hand reaching for his hunting knife. His fingers trembled, fumbling at his belt, but he didn't unsheath it. This was his brother, wasn't it? He couldn't hurt David, but was this thing even David anymore? "What do you want?" Joe managed to croak out. He glanced at the glowing symbol on the wall, its light pulsing faster now, as though responding to the tension in the room. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly as if the cabin were alive. David's head tilted unnaturally far to one side, his mouth stretched into a grotesque imitation of a smile. "To make you see," the voice hissed. "You came looking for the truth, didn't you? You should have stayed blind." The cabin shuddered violently, and the dirt floor beneath Joe's feet cracked, revealing a deep black void that pulsed with the same eerie light as the symbol. The light intensified, throwing the room into stark relief. Shadows danced wildly along the walls, shapes that shouldn't exist, twisting and writhing in ways that defied logic. Joe's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. His brother, or the thing wearing his brother's body, began to rise, levitating inches above the floor. The shadows coalesced around him, enveloping his form until David was no longer visible, replaced by a towering, shifting mass of darkness. "You have seen too much," the mass intoned, the voice reverberating through Joe's bones. "You will not leave unchanged." The light from the symbol exploded outward, blinding Joe. He threw his hands up to shield his eyes, but the afterimage burned into his retinas. In the split second of darkness that followed, he felt something slam into him, knocking him to the ground. His vision swam as he scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the dirt. When the light returned, the room was different. The walls were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of black void. The glowing symbol floated in the air, its light casting eerie reflections off nothingness. The cabin had dissolved entirely, leaving Joe alone with the thing that had taken his brother. The mass of shadows was larger now, its form shifting and growing. Faces appeared within it, distorted and screaming silently, their mouths opening and closing in an endless cycle of agony. Joe could feel their torment, their despair, as though it were his own. And then, he heard the whispers again. They were inside his head now, probing, digging into his memories. He saw flashes of his childhood, of him and David playing in the woods, their laughter echoing through the trees. He saw his mother's face, her warm smile fading into grief as the years passed. He saw the moment they found the well, the decision to descend into the darkness. The voices grew louder, overwhelming, until they weren't whispers, but shouts, a cacophony of sound that threatened to tear Joe's mind apart. "Enough!" Joe shouted, his voice raw and desperate. He forced himself to his feet, his knees shaking. "Take me if you want, but let my brother go. He didn't ask for this." The shadows froze, the faces within them twisting to face Joe. The cacophony ceased, replaced by a single resonant voice. "You offer yourself?" Joe hesitated. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to say no, to fight, to run. But the image of David's lifeless body haunted him. He couldn't leave his brother to this fate, not after everything they'd been through. "Yes?" Joe said, his voice steady, despite the fear gripping his heart. "Let him go. Take me instead." The shadows began to move, swirling and shifting, closing in around Joe. The light from the symbol dimmed, casting the void into a deep, oppressive gloom. The faces within the darkness grinned, their mouths widening to impossible proportions. "You will know the cost of truth," the voice intoned. Joe braced himself, his fists clenched as the shadows enveloped him. The cold was immediate, seeping into his bones, stealing the air from his lungs. He felt himself being pulled, dragged down into the void. And then, everything went black. Joe awoke with a gasp, his chest heaving as if he'd been drowning. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by dim light filtering through an ancient forest canopy. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of moss and decay. His body ached, as if he'd been stretched thin and snapped back into place. He tried to sit up, but his limbs felt like lead. Groaning, he scanned his surroundings. The forest was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Trees loomed impossibly tall, their twisted branches writhing like veins against the pale gray sky. The ground was uneven, covered in an unnatural carpet of pale, fleshy mushrooms that pulsated faintly, as if alive. Joe's breath caught as he realized he wasn't alone. Figures moved through the trees, just at the edge of his vision. They weren't human, at least not entirely. Their forms flickered, shifting between shapes as they moved. One moment, they seemed like shadowy humanoid figures. The next, they stretched into grotesque insect-like forms. Their movements were fluid and silent, as though they were gliding rather than walking. Joe tried to call out, but his voice was a raspy croak. The figures stopped, their heads, or what passed for heads, turning toward him in unison. They began to move closer, the air around them shimmering like heat waves. "No," Joe whispered, forcing his body to move. He scrambled backward, his hands sinking into the spongy ground. "Stay back." The figures didn't stop. Their flickering forms grew more distinct as they neared. Their faces, or the lack thereof, were blank slates of darkness, yet he felt their gaze pierce through him, probing his mind. His heart pounded as the whispers returned, louder now, like a chorus of distant voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped and tilted its head. Its form solidified into something vaguely humanoid, though its proportions were disturbingly wrong. Arms too long, legs bending the wrong way, joints bulging unnaturally. Joe's panic swelled as the creature extended an arm, a long, spindly finger pointing directly at him. "You do not belong," it said in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, echoing within his mind. "I didn't choose this," Joe shouted, his voice finally breaking free. I just wanted to save my brother." The creature paused, as if considering his words. The others stopped as well, their flickering forms coalescing into similarly distorted figures. They surrounded Joe in a wide circle, their blank faces watching intently. "The pact was made," the first figure intoned. "The cost must be paid." Joe shook his head violently. "What pact? I didn't agree to this. I didn't—" But the memory flooded back. His desperate plea in the cabin, his offer to take his brother's place, the haunting voice of the shadowy mass. "You offer yourself?" Joe's stomach churned. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "No, I didn't understand what—" "The shadow plane understands all," another figure interrupted, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You crossed the threshold. You saw the truth. Now you must become its vessel." Joe's mind reeled. "Vessel? No, I won't." A deafening roar erupted from the forest, shaking the ground. The figures around him froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. Joe followed their gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. Emerging from the trees was a towering figure, its form writhing with shadows. It was the same entity he'd seen in the cabin, the same mass of darkness and faces. But here, it was larger, more terrible, its presence bending reality itself. The air around it warped, twisting into unnatural spirals. The shadow mass spoke, its voice booming. "The vessel resists. The truth remains incomplete." The other figures bowed their heads, their forms flickering as though in deference. Joe, trembling, tried to rise to his feet, but the sheer weight of the entity's presence pinned him down. "You are nothing but a seed," the shadow intoned. "To see the truth is to become it. To escape it is to deny existence." The entity extended a tendril of darkness toward Joe. He felt its cold, invasive touch against his mind, peeling back layers of thought, memory, and willpower. He screamed, his voice raw and echoing through the forest. But then something shifted. A faint light appeared in the distance, cutting through the oppressive darkness. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily, illuminating the forest in a warm, golden glow. The shadow entity recoiled, its tendrils snapping back as the light spread. Joe turned his head, squinting against the brightness. The light coalesced into a figure, a human figure. As it stepped closer, Joe's heart skipped a beat. It was David. But this wasn't the same David he'd seen in the cabin. This David radiated strength, his form glowing with an otherworldly energy. His eyes shone like twin suns, and his voice, when he spoke, was calm, but powerful. "He's not yours," David said, his words resonating through the forest. The shadow entity growled, its form writhing in defiance. "He made the pact. The cost must—" "No," David interrupted, his voice cutting through the shadow's protest like a blade. "He offered himself for me, but I'm here to take my place." Joe's eyes widened. "David, no, you can't—" David smiled, his expression serene. "It's okay, Joe. I understand now. This was never meant for you. It was always meant for me." Before Joe could protest further, David stepped forward, placing himself between Joe and the shadow entity. The light around him intensified, pushing back the darkness. The shadow roared, its form collapsing inward as the light consumed it. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the figures surrounding Joe dissolved into mist. The light grew blinding, enveloping everything. Joe felt himself being lifted, pulled away from the chaos. Then, silence. When Joe regained consciousness, he was lying on the cold, hard ground. The golden light that had surrounded him was gone, replaced by an eerie twilight. The forest seemed different now, still oppressive, but somehow quieter, as though holding its breath. He sat up slowly, his head pounding, and his limbs heavy. The last thing he remembered was David stepping into the light, facing down the shadow entity. Panic surged through him. "David?" Joe called out, his voice hoarse. The sound seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. "David, where are you?" There was no response. Joe stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The forest stretched out in every direction, the trees impossibly tall and twisted. He realized with a sinking feeling that he had no idea where he was, or even if he was still in the same reality. A faint whisper reached his ears. At first, it was barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But as Joe strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, forming words that sent chills down his spine. "Follow the light." Joe spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just the endless trees and the faint, pulsing mushrooms beneath his feet. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A faint glimmer of golden light, like the one that had surrounded David. He hesitated. The light was a beacon, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it might also be a trap. Yet, what choice did he have? Staying here, in this endless nightmare, wasn't an option. He steeled himself and began to walk toward the light. As he moved through the forest, the light seemed to shift, always just out of reach. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by faint laughter that echoed unnaturally. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, and the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Joe's heart pounded as he quickened his pace. The laughter grew louder, more maniacal, and he realized with a jolt that it wasn't coming from one source. There were multiple voices, all mocking, all sinister. He broke into a run, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The light flickered ahead, growing brighter but never closer. The laughter followed him, accompanied by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and growing closer. "David!" Joe shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "David, help me!" The light flickered again, and this time it seemed to explode outward, illuminating the forest in a blinding flash. Joe stumbled, shielding his eyes. When he lowered his hands, the forest was gone. He was standing in a vast, empty void. The ground beneath his feet was smooth and black, reflecting the faint light of a single golden orb hovering in the distance. The orb pulsed gently, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched endlessly. Joe approached the orb cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he drew closer, he realized there was something inside it. A figure. His heart leapt. "David!" The figure turned, and Joe's blood ran cold. It wasn't David. It was himself. The reflection of Joe inside the orb stared back at him with an expression of utter despair. Its eyes were hollow, its face gaunt and lifeless. It raised a trembling hand and pointed directly at Joe. "You are the light," the reflection said, its voice distorted and echoing. "You are the shadow." Joe stumbled back, shaking his head. No, this isn't real. This isn't." The orb shattered. The void around him exploded into chaos. Shadows erupted from the ground, writhing and twisting as they coalesced into monstrous forms. The whispers returned, now a deafening cacophony of voices that overlapped and clashed. "You are ours," the voices chanted. "You belong to the shadow." Joe screamed, his voice swallowed by the chaos. The shadows surged toward him, their forms shifting and contorting. He felt their cold touch against his skin, their claws tearing at his mind. And then, everything stopped. The shadows froze mid-motion, their forms dissolving into mist. The cacophony of voices faded into silence. Joe collapsed to his knees, trembling and gasping for air. The golden light returned, but it was different now. Fainter, weaker. Joe looked up and saw David standing before him, his form barely visible within the light. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with sadness. "Joe," David said, his voice gentle, "it's time to let go." Joe shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, I can't. I can't leave you here." David smiled faintly. "You don't understand. You were never here to save me. You were here to save yourself." Before Joe could respond, the light enveloped him, and the void dissolved into nothingness. Joe woke up on the forest floor with a gasp, the damp, earthy scent of moss filling his lungs. His entire body ached as if he'd been pummeled for hours. Blinking against the pale dawn light filtering through the canopy, he sat up and scanned his surroundings. The forest looked normal. There were no glowing mushrooms, no distorted shadows, and no golden light. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by the soft hum of morning insects and distant birdsong. For a moment, Joe wondered if it had all been a dream. But then he noticed his hands. They were trembling, his palms smeared with faint golden streaks that sparkled like embers. His heart sank. "David," he croaked, his voice breaking. He turned in every direction, calling his brother's name, but the forest remained eerily silent. And then he saw it. Lying a few feet away was David's jacket, neatly folded on a mossy rock. On top of it was something that stopped Joe's breath. Their childhood photo, the one that had hung in their parents' living room for decades. Only now, the image had changed. David's face was blank, a smudged void where his features had been. Joe clutched the photo, his chest tightening. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." A voice interrupted him, soft and familiar. "You did well, Joe." He spun around, and his blood ran cold. Standing in the shadows of the trees was David, or something that looked like him. His posture was stiff, his expression unnervingly calm, and his eyes were black pits, reflecting nothing. "David?" Joe's voice cracked as he took a hesitant step forward. "Is that you?" The figure tilted its head, almost bird-like. "I am what remains of him," it said, its voice layered with a low, guttural undertone. "You were given a choice, and you made it." Joe felt his knees weaken. "What choice? I didn't choose anything. I just wanted to save you." The figure smiled faintly, a cruel, unnatural twist of its lips. "And you did, in your own way, but the cost was never yours to decide." Before Joe could respond, the figure stepped forward, and its form began to dissolve. Shadows peeled away from its body, curling and writhing as they disappeared into the forest. Soon, there was nothing left but the faint scent of burnt wood. Joe staggered back, clutching the photo and David's jacket. He didn't understand what had happened, or if he ever would. All he knew was that the forest had taken something from him, something irreplaceable. But as he turned to leave, the forest shifted again. The trees loomed closer, their trunks twisting in unnatural spirals. The air grew colder, heavier, and the golden light returned, flickering at the edges of his vision. A voice whispered in his ear, soft and mocking. "It's not over." Joe bolted, clutching the photo and jacket as he ran. He didn't stop until he burst out of the forest and into the bright, open expanse of a familiar clearing. His car was there, parked exactly where he'd left it. For a moment, relief washed over him. He climbed into the driver's seat, tossing the photo and jacket onto the passenger seat. But as he reached for the ignition, his hand froze. The keys were already in the ignition. A chill crept down his spine. Slowly, he turned his head toward the passenger seat. David's jacket was gone. In its place was a single blackened feather. And then, from the back seat, a whisper. "You can't leave." The last thing Joe saw was his own reflection in the rearview mirror. His eyes, no longer his, were as black as the void. And the forest? The forest was just beginning to breathe again.